Well, we're very excited. We have with us our very special guest, our friend, Brian Heiler.
Welcome, Brian.
Hey, pleasure to be here.
We finally got to meet you some last year, actually, at the Mego meet.
That's right. You guys had a table.
We were so excited to be there. Mego meet wouldn't be possible with all these other things that came before Mego meet. People in the toy collecting world, especially the vintage toy world, know about the Mego Museum. They know about Plaid Stallions. Let's start at the beginning, though. Brian, where did you grow up, and what was your childhood like?
I grew up just outside of Toronto, Ontario, in Canada. It seemed like it was really far away from Toronto when I was a kid, but really I live about 20 minutes away. I just, there was a lot more fields in between the city and me at that time. My mother and father actually ran a small company that distributed all kinds of general merchandise to stores. My dad would spend, he would leave Monday and he'd come back Friday night, and he would service these stores. He was called a rack jobber, and his whole business was stuff like kites and pantyhose and records and toys, like lots of impulse toys. And, being a small family business, even as, when I was 5 or 6 years old, I would end up like working in my dad's warehouse, packing orders. And basically they just couldn't afford a sitter. So I enjoyed it. I wanted to be in the warehouse doing that stuff. And,
what's the time frame for this?
This would be the mid 1970s. So this is like 75, 76. And because I was born in 70, but late 70s. So I only knew this life. I can remember I actually, when I was 2 years old, snuck out of the house to go to my dad's work to visit him. And I got picked up by the cops because, you're a barefoot kid in the middle of winter. And, I almost made it. By the way, I was almost there. But so I've always kind of, this was the weird, it isn't weird when you grow up in it, but it's a weird life for every other kid whose dad worked a job and came home at 5 o'clock, But one of the more, I think, impactful things on my childhood were going to, on like Saturday, the family would go somewhere and my dad would stop in at a distributor's place, to pick up new merchandise or look at new merchandise. And I remember shopping toys with him when I was a kid. And also he subscribed to all the toy industry magazines like Playthings and Toy and Hobby World and the imaginatively named Toys magazine. And I would pour through those. And it was like looking at how the sausage was made. Like I knew who Marty Abrams of Mego was when I was like 7 years old. That's the guy who runs Mego, and that was probably not every kid's growing up, that, like to know that toys come from just wholesalers and then the distributors sell them and, there's closeouts and all that stuff. That's probably not like a normal kid's thing. And I've told this story a million times, but my dad bought all the closeouts of the Planet of the Apes action figures from the distributor of Mego in Canada, which was called Parkdale Novelty. He bought like skids of just General Urko because Sears had canceled an order. And I swore, in my 6 or 7 year old brain that there would be more characters in those cases if I just opened every single one. The workers in Hong Kong would have put a Galen and a Burke and Verdon in there. And of course I was totally wrong, but I literally did open like 100 cases of Planet of the Apes figures as a kid. I remember doing that.
That's amazing.
I wish I kept 10 cases of Planet of the Apes figures, but I didn't.
So when it came to pop culture, television, movies, magazines, what was your feeding ground?
Well, I was always interested in, cartoons, and science fiction was a very early age with things like Planet of the Apes and $6 Million Man, Space 1999. Like, I was 5 when all that stuff was big. But I think the thing, and it's your namesake, is the thing that really became my internet as a kid, and I've talked about this on my own podcast, is Starlog magazine. That was the first thing I can honestly remember connecting to as a child, because it was taking it seriously and I could understand it.
We always say that's our generation's internet. If you were a geek, that's where you found out what was happening. That's where you found out the history of things that you missed. I mean, that was just our whole world.
Yeah, and in fact, I'll even be honest with you. I think when I was 10 or 11, I found an issue of Famous Monsters, which was probably, people 10 years my seniors' internet. And I found it incomprehensible and hard to read because I had been spoiled by Starlog's straightforward, it was pretty good journalism, to be perfectly honest with you. I thought I can still read an old Starlog and understand what I got out of that as a kid.
And Famous Monsters tended not to be in the present. I mean, we read Famous Monsters. I was aware of Famous Monsters before Starlog because my grandfather got Famous Monsters. But it was always in the past. Very rarely did they talk about things that were current. It wasn't until the late 70s where they stepped up their game, and I believe they stepped up their game because of Starlog.
Yeah, that very well could be. I think I bought the Famous Monsters as a kid because it was dealing with the past. And I was fascinated, and I've always been fascinated with what I missed, if that makes any sense. At the time, I think that I found that Famous Monsters Lost in Space had been rerunning. And of course, I'd never seen the show before I was like 10. So I became kind of like fascinated with Lost in Space and what I wanted to learn everything I could learn from the show. And Starlog generally didn't really talk about it much because it's kind of silly. It's not quite, they did a couple articles about it, but it wasn't something. They were more focused on what was going on now, and of course they were very, very Star Trek biased, which made a lot of sense at the time.
So we have a connection in the Mego world. I mean, I just remember those Mego dolls. Because they seem to have everything. They had TV shows, they had movies, they had rock groups, they had superheroes. It was just amazing, the world of Mego. Tell us how you got into Mego when you were a kid.
Well, it's hard for me to say because, like I said, I was born in late 1970, and one of my very earliest memories is playing in the basement with my Mego Batman and Robin. I can't tell you where I got them, but that's got to be like 74, so I'm 3 years old playing with, Mego Batman and Robin. I remember I almost lost my Mego Spider-Man in a tree in kindergarten because, I was throwing up in a tree. So they were just there. And I think as a kid, when I think of being a kid, there were three big things. There was Mego Superheroes, there was G.I. Joe, and there was Big Jim. And both G.I. Joe and Big Jim disappeared before I turned 6. Like they were just kind of like gone. And by the end of 1976, they were kind of over, or maybe before I turned 7. I'm not sure. And then Mego, what they did was they just kept adding new and interesting licenses in that format. So, from superheroes to Planet of the Apes to Star Trek. And those are, to me, like those are my prime years of playing with action figures. Like it all changed around 78 when the Star Wars figures came out. But I think for me, Mego just left that indelible impression on me during those formative years. And those are my favorite years of Mego toys, is from about 73 to about 77.
Oh, absolutely. Totally agree.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I had lots of fun with late 70s Mego stuff. I was a really Mego loyal kid right until the end. And, I love the pocket superheroes and all that stuff, but I have such a predilection for like 74 and 75. it's just something I can't even begin to explain. That is where and unfortunately those are very expensive years to collect if you're a Mego collector as well.
And I don't know about you, but I was exposed to so many things because of Mego. I never knew Kiss was a rock group, but there was a kid in my class that had the Kiss doll. So I thought they were villains for Spider-Man because he had the 12-inch Spider-Man and the 12-inch Gene Simmons. I watched Star Trek because my dad bought me the Mego dolls of him. I started reading comic books because I had the Mego dolls. Like, Mego was the entry to so many things that I would have a lifelong love for.
Yeah, I can see that a little bit. I bought the Star Trek dolls because my only sibling is 5 years older than me, and she was obsessed with William Shatner when I was like 5, and she was going to marry him, and so she would put on Star Trek every Saturday morning, and I would be like, I remember being kind of reluctant at first to it, but then I grew up thinking Star Trek was a Saturday morning television show. Like I thought it was just like Land of the Lost or anything else. And so when the dolls came out, and it's this thing I see on Saturday morning every week, I had to have those. I remember that. I vividly remember having to have the Star Trek characters. But I'm just trying to think if I ever got exposed to anything. I think if you want to say it, Planet of the Apes, the Mego dolls made me want to know everything about Planet of the Apes. Like, I was obsessed with the Mego doll.
Oh, totally. Let's fast forward some years later. You still love all this cool stuff like we all do. But you were thinking about, correct me if I'm wrong, you were thinking about or in the process of writing a book about Mego?
Yeah, in the 80s. In the 80s, I started one. And then in the early 90s, I was just out of college. And I was living in this terrible apartment building. And two of my close friends were living in the same building. We all just kind of decided to move in together and regret it. And one of my friends, he was, at the time, he had just come out of graphic design school. Graphic design was one of those courses, we're talking like 93, 94, where people were just getting these big jobs, and he had this amazing setup of a computer, and we were, I honestly at the time thought, oh my God, I can make this dream happen. I can make my Mego book. I'd been trying to do it since high school, and we were working night and day on it at the time because I actually was only part-time employed. I started my own company. I was all over the place. I was like 24 years old, and I was driving around Ontario because I've been collecting toys since I was about 16 or 15, and I was trying to find every connection I had, and I would go to people's houses and photograph their collections. And I was a pretty decent photographer, luckily. And I was just trying to amass everything Mego ever made. And it's just such a big task. I mean, I'm still not done, and I'm almost 50 now. But yeah, that was always my dream, was to write a book about everything Mego.
And tell us what became of that.
Well, I think a lot of it got thrown into the Mego Museum, where, I think there was a point in the early 2000s where I was updating something in the Mego Museum every single day. Someone would send me a card variant or a figure variant or a new figure discovery. And I can honestly remember I think about 2004, I had updated the Mego Museum like 400 times in 1 year. So, a lot of my energy went into that and running the community that we were building, the forums and the various different the early beginnings of social media. I think the Mego Museum still has a MySpace page if anyone wants to find it. I can't log into it anymore.
For our listeners who are unaware, tell us what the Mego Museum is.
The Mego Museum began in, I believe, 1996. It's like almost 25 years old now. It was the creation of my friend Robin Adams, who is a brilliant artist and designer. And the the stuff she was doing with the site was blowing people's minds. She was a digital painter. And, the Mego Museum in 1996, you're a Gen X kid, you're logging on, and here's this beautiful love letter to the toys of your youth that you've forgotten the name of. And it was like a lighthouse for a lot of like-minded people. I've met friends through the Mego Museum that I talk to, once a week for the last, 10, 20 years. It's a wonderful, it's a wonderful legacy to have. And it definitely brought me in. So when Robin decided to do some real world stuff at the end of the century, I said, well, let me have it. Let me just keep adding photos and running the forums. I mean, I'm here every day anyways, and I've got so much to give. And I'm really grateful that she released control to me of it, because it made me want to learn how to use Photoshop. It made me want to be a better writer. It made me create my own website. It made me create my own book. Like it all set me down this path of creativity that I'm still on to this day. And, just from that action of going, fine, I don't care. And eventually Robin did come back, and we made the museum even better. And I think it gets better every week, because we keep adding to it. We keep growing. We have this wonderful convention every year. It's been a wonderful ride, to be perfectly honest with you. And it, if you're going to do something with your hobby, there's a lot of things you can do. And, the downside of doing something with your hobby is you've got to interact with other people, and there's lots of other personalities. But if you actually are creating something, something for other people to appreciate and enjoy and share and feel normal, I think that's its own reward in some regards.
No doubt about it. Now, because of your creativeness, all the different tools that you learned, your skill set that you learned from the Mego Museum, what was your next venture?
Well, I think around 2005, 2006, what I was doing was I collect catalogs as well. And I also collect those toy trade magazines that I grew up reading as a kid. And what I would do is I would buy these huge lots of catalogs and magazines, and I would scan the pages that had Mego content and Mego articles, and I would put them on the Mego Museum, and people would go, neat. And I'd sit there and look through all the other stuff, the other 95% of the publication, and I'd go like, God, there's a lot of fun stuff in here, and I'm just putting this on a shelf. And a couple of things kind of happened at once. One thing was I found all this really interesting toy insider information specific to a toy line, and I scanned it all, and I offered it to a guy, and I won't say the thing or the guy because I'm still friends with the guy, but and he just kind of ignored me. Like I said, hey, look at this, I got all this great stuff. And he just kept ignoring me, and I kept thinking, like, well, I'd really like to share this with the world. The second thing that happened was my wife and I used to, in bed, sift through old 70s catalogs and make snarky comments. That was kind of like our ritual in the evenings. And in high school, I collected catalogs in high school. I was that guy. And I used to have a wall in my locker of pictures of guys in leisure suits, and it just said the Plaid Stallions, because that was just the word. And I just decided, like, I want to create a website that doesn't talk about Mego. It just talks about all this other crap that's in my head. So we talk about, catalogs and toys, and when Spider-Man came to the mall, and old coloring books, and everything that I'm obsessed with. And obscure television, weird movies. And I just started the blog one day. I put my daughter down for a nap. Everyone else was out of the house. And I thought, well, what am I going to do with myself this afternoon? And I have what you call the ADHD. And I decided to create a blog that day. And I created the Plaid Stallions blog, I think in April of 2006. And, 5 years later, I was creating an action figure based on the mascot that I had created for the site. A year later, I had a book being published. It was a weird journey. It was just, if I had any advice to give to anyone ever, act on your impulses. If you feel like you want to do something, sit down and do it. Put yourself out there. Good things come. They're really, from that whole journey, it's been sort of like, how did I get here? But it's been a lot of fun getting here. My dad always said, if your work is fun, you don't know you're working. And I've seriously enjoyed creating this stuff. A couple of years ago, I decided, well, there's a lot of people on YouTube taking the information from my site and making videos. And I'd see my logo, and I'd see scans, I'd see photos from my collection on YouTube. A lot of people ask, some people don't. And I decided, well, if they're going to do that, I should probably do that. They're reading what I wrote. So I've started to kind of branch out into YouTube. And, that's way out of my comfort zone. I'm a very private guy. I'm not very public. But that's been a fantastic experience. It just keeps growing and getting better. And I'm meeting lots of new people and having fun with it. So, like I said, it's all just been leaps of faith over the years. There was a couple of Mego conventions prior to Mego Meet. There was one in, I want to say 98, that I wasn't involved with, and that was an interesting con, but I don't think it was a big success. It was in Ohio, oddly enough. Then there was Mego Con in 2004, and that was two fellows, and I did happen to know who they were, and I was mildly involved. I helped promote it, but it wasn't a Mego Museum event. It was two guys doing it, and it was in New York, and it was popular enough, but it was also a very expensive event, and I'm not sure how well those guys did, but they did manage to reunite, Marty Abrams and Neil Kublin, and even Neil Adams showed up. So in a lot of ways, it was a big success. So that left the Mego Museum community interested in running a show. And what happened, I believe, and this is, my memory is old, but somebody pointed us to having, there was a toy museum in Wheeling, West Virginia. And they hosted a Marx convention every year for Marx collectors. And this fella said, why don't you guys try and get a Mego convention going? So there was a fellow who lived in the town by the name of Bill, and a fellow that worked at the Mego Museum who I'm still friends with, but he doesn't collect Mego anymore. His name was Dave. And they kind of were the initial showrunners with one of the fellows who did Mego Con. The Mego Meet has a lot of fathers and a lot of people that, I always handled the PR aspect of Mego Meet, but that really wasn't as hands-on as some of the other things. Like, I paid for, I managed to get the money for toy shop ads, get the toy shop ad designed, or I would run over to magazines and other places and ask them to talk about Mego Meet. I was writing for Lee's Action Figure News and Toy Shop at the time, so I was able to get a little bit of that going on. But there was always like 3 or 4 guys who were running the show and making it happen. And as the years waned on, I think we did 10 years in Wheeling, West Virginia. And by the end of it, it was basically myself and another fellow by the name of Steve Moore. And Steve Moore said, we've kind of outgrown this space. We're not going to get any bigger. Let's move the show to a new city. I'll run it. And, I will always say that it's like, 80-20. Like Steve is a machine, and I'm helper monkey. And we moved it to Chicago for 3 years. We teamed up with a company called Ah Yeah Comics, run by Art Balthazar, and we called it Ah Yeah Mego Meet for 3 years. And then Steve said, let's move it to Columbus, Ohio. Steve has he lives in Columbus, Ohio, and he's also an event coordinator there. So he has all these relationships, and it's always important. People always say, why don't you have Mego Meet here? And it's always their backyard. And I understand and I empathize. I live outside of Toronto. I'm always driving or flying to Mego Meet. It's a show that, for 6 years I've worked the table, but I've never had it in my backyard. But it is really important to have a showrunner on the ground wherever you're going to do it, just so that everything runs smoothly. There's a lot of hard work in these events, and we don't do this for a profit, and I think that's what makes Mego Meet kind of special. Is it's not really a toy show. It's more like a clubhouse get-together masquerading as a toy show. So if folks wanted to walk in and start toy shopping, they absolutely could, but everybody knows each other at Mego Meet.
We tried to describe exactly what Mego Meet is like because it's so radically different than all the conventions that we attended. So paint us a picture. What's a day like attending Mego Meet?
Well, like for me, I always feel like the groom at a wedding. I always wanted to make sure everyone's happy, greeting everybody. In fact, I'm a kind of an introverted soul, and I often leave Mego Meet and go hide. Like the last night of Mego Meet, I never go to the dinners. I just go and go sit in a bar by myself. Being part of Mego Meet is, for me, a lot like being a groom at a wedding, because it's so much greeting. It's so much saying hi, because it is like this giant family reunion. It was built out of a community of people who know each other and like to see each other once a year. They become old friends. I mean, I have seen Paul Clark, Dr. Mego, and guys like Roberto and Tom Ligotti and Steve Moore and all these people. I've seen them once a year for like 15, 16 years. So it's become very chummy and very inclusive and very, we add new people come in, come out. But the best thing I've ever heard someone say about Mego Meet was a first-time dealer said, I left my table and I worried somebody might take something. And the person said, oh, don't worry about it. You'll be fine. And he kind of knew that he wasn't at a regular toy show. He knew that everyone just kind of looks out for each other here. There's no theft at Mego Meet. It's not as big or as well attended as some shows, but it is a really kind of small vibe. We don't care if we get 10,000 people in the door. We just want to have a good time. We're not a for-profit business. We're just looking to pay our bills. And I like to think that kind of passes down to everybody, that kind of chill vibe.
It's amazing. It was an amazing experience when we went last year. And we felt so comfortable. And it was great to be around other people that, especially for the 70s, it's focused on retro things. And your site, Plaid Stallions, it draws people who have fond memories of that era.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's supposed to be like a lighthouse for Gen X kids. And I find Gen X kids, we're all a bit sarcastic. We're all a bit cynical. And, I don't take anything too terribly seriously. I like to look back on it in a fondness. I don't think, I remember my original header for the site was, mocking the 70s one catalog page at a time. And somebody wrote me and said, yeah, you're not really mocking it. You're kind of having fun with it. I would change that. And I did. I took that away, and I just went reliving the 70s one catalog page at a time, because we're having fun and we're poking fun, but we kid because we love, you know. I love this stuff. I love it dearly, but I can also laugh at it and just have a good time with it.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the force be with you. Nanu Nanu.